So I'm very sad I can't be there in person, but it's my pleasure to be introducing Ruivaldo Viana at his Master's of Science Defense on his thesis on valuing Hawaii's trails, a choice experiment to assess willingness to pay for sustainable management of recreational trails in Hawaii. I got the pleasure of getting to know Valdo when he first came to NREM and joined the Olson Lab, as well as a student in the Valuing Nature back in fall of 2024 when he was still on your master's environmental management pathway. His willingness to deep dive into the methodological approaches, model assumptions, heterogeneity issues, and all the nerdy environmental econ jargon made him a perfect fit for this project that he will be presenting on today. I cannot say enough good things about his work as a researcher and the time I've had to work with him. I personally have learned so much, and I'm so proud of both the time you have spent here working on this and your next chapter. As some of you may know, Waldo will be continuing his work on valuing the benefits of nature um, and incorporating those into our decision making as he is going to join a PhD program in Perth, Australia at the University of Western Australia this coming fall. And I'm so very excited to see the work you do over your career. So without much further ado, I am honored to welcome you all here and to learn from Valdo today.
Thank you. Thank you, Ashley. Can you hear me all right? Okay, perfect. I will try to move the screen out and this one on. Okay. AI, no. Okay. Can people online see the slides? Yes. Okay. Let me just hide this thing. Where did you go? Oh. All right. I think this is good. Okay. Ashley, thank you very much for the introduction and everybody who helped support the research so far. Privileged to present today and very, very grateful for the opportunity. Again, like Ashley said, I'm Valdo. I've been working on this project for about a year and a half or so, almost 2 years. Presented a few of these results in different conferences, and in each conference, we always get different feedback. So hopefully this is as close as it's good to go and result-wise and methodology-wise. Okay, the title of this research is Valuing Hawaii's Trails, survey-based choice experiment to assess willingness to pay for sustainable management of recreational trails here in Hawaii. My committee is Dr. Kirsten Olson, who's here. Co-chair is Ashley McKenzie, just introducing me, and then Derek Reese is also here. Contribute to this paper also Dr. Melissa Price and Dr. Kristen Hartman. Okay, so when we think about trails and think about the value of trails, there are many ways to assess them. One of the ways you can assess the value of trails is looking at its direct contribution to the economy. The way you can measure that is through outdoor recreation value added as a percent of GDP. In 2023, if you compare all the outdoor recreation value as a percent of GDP across all states, Hawaii ranks the highest at 6.3%. For reference, that's about 7 billion total contribution to the economy. Not to say this is all trail values, but off of that, 700 million of them are attributed to conventional outdoor recreation, which is including values that you use trails, economic activities that use trails, like hiking, camping, and so on. There are other ways you can see the value of trails, not necessarily in the economy, but as a public safety. As this article came out after the fire in Lahaina, talking about trail as this emergency escape route for climate-related hazards, not just for people to escape, but also emergency responders to access the place. And lastly, here in Hawaii and many Pacific places, including my home country, Timor, trails are also seen as historic or cultural significant values that are beyond sort of the economic and recreational value they can think. You can comp those values and like group them in the eye of the economy into two main economic value. One is called use value and non-use values. Use values are basically the values that are come from you using a certain natural resources. So here, in the case of trails, extractive is not particularly applying. It's basically you consuming that trail. So it's here, it doesn't really apply, but you can think of them, the use value of trails as non-extractive, sort of the recreational use of those trails. That's how much you value, that's how you can measure its benefits and so on. And then there's others like ecosystem services that are related to the trails. And the other side of the value of the economy in here is sort of the values that not particularly come out of the using of them, but values that you hold intrinsically. One is what they refer to as option value. That is the value that you have towards this trail of being able to use them for tomorrow. There's other values that also related to existence value, knowing that this trail exists. Even if you don't use them, you just value for its existence. And lastly, what economists refer to as bequest value, which is basically the value of preserving this trail for future generations. Unfortunately, in many decision-making and policies and market valuation, often the trail values that related to trail are only seen through the use side of the valuation. So you can see, like example, how I showed you outdoor recreational, you can count those trail attribution to the economy based on the use and the recreational people. You can count how many people use them, and that's basically the value that is measurable and is concrete. The other side of the equation, the non-use values are often not measurable. That's something that policymakers not often see, and it's hard to measure, especially it's the value that people hold intrinsically to themselves, right? And often that's the case where when policy decision makers making a decision on how much to invest, they're missing one side of the picture, especially those non-use values. When that is the case, that can lead to limited funding for trail management and maintenance, as this article highlighted. And the studies have found that with limited funding of management of trails and maintenance, there can lead to ecological costs like erosion, vegetation loss of invasive species, and disturbance of native biodiversity and wildlife. And then there are also social costs that comes with this. You're thinking about not enough money to maintain the trails, so there could be closed trails, trail-related rescues, dangerous trails, and even access issues like parking and so on. This is the case that also applies to Naala Hele Trail and Access Program, which is the study case for this research. Naala Hele has over 1 million acres of land, 150 plus trails, and state-wise is about 500 miles coverage. Naala Hele has about 2-3 full-time professionals per county and is currently managed by DOFA, which is Division of Forest and Wildlife. Here's the trail maps across all the main islands. The problem that Naala Hele face is similar to many conservation programs that are faced. One is limited resources. For reference, there's a less than 1% of state budget that is allocated to all management, to all the management of natural resources, that is marine and terrestrial. And a smaller portion of that is allocated to DOFA, and a smaller portion of that is allocated to Naala Hele. As you can imagine, it's basically, without putting it to value, it's very strained in terms of resources. Not to mention the limited staffing. You're thinking 2 to 3 people full-time looking over all these trails per county. That's a lot of the sort of management and a lot of work to face. And then there's case of overuse, where there's nearly 10 million visitors annually coming to Hawaii, and then there's increase in popularity of hiking. This article highlighted, I think back in 2019, talking about how managers basically, their task every day is to deal with the current demand and sort of the short-term goals. So what this happens is management becomes very reactive to short-term sort of problem rather than thinking about long-term sustainable solutions. To address some of this problem, DOFA is working closely with UH Manoa, specifically Wildlife Ecology Lab and also SLAP at the NREM, to tackle some of those problems. This grant project that we're working on is Recreational Trail Research Project. There's 3 prongs that we try to address this issue. One is the trail vulnerability assessment, which is leading by Derek, who's here, trail action decision analysis, leading by Dr. Kristen Harmon. And then our side is trail recreational economic studies, specifically trying to answer that question of how should we pay for trail management and how do we measure the value of trails that the market miss, specifically the non-use values. So the objective of this research, particularly to estimate the value of recreational trails by estimating the use and the non-use values. So the recreational side of the trail use, and then also the non-recreational side, the values that you hold intrinsically, the option, the existence, and the bequest. We have 2 methods that we're trying to address those values and trying to estimate those values. One is travel costs, currently leading by Dr. Ashley McKenzie, lovely introduction. It's basically using travel costs to measure how much you value those trails based on how much you spend to go to those trails transportation-wise, like the cost of you spending transportation. The other one, which is the stated willingness to pay, is the study that I'm currently leading, but also part of this thesis. is basically, instead of measuring how much people value based on how much they spend, we're just literally asking them how much you're willing to pay for trail management that is care for recreational use, but also non-use values. So both sides. And from there, the state willingness to pay, basically, what we're trying to do is measure how much tourists and residents willing to pay for trail management. And then also within that survey of our study, we're also looking at whether there's any preferences on fee system, if there's thinking about that down the road. And then eventually from this objective, you go down to sort of informing payment strategy for sustainable trail management, feeding back to that grant research. Okay, for the next 20 minutes or so, hopefully, I will talk to you specifically more about how do we measure the tourist and residents' willingness to pay for the trail management. Okay, here is a review of our study. What we basically found is that there is very high overall willingness to pay, very high value of people willing to pay for ecological health and infrastructure, trail infrastructure improvements. We also found that improvements of those ecological health and trail infrastructure are preferred over improvement of less crowded trails. Basically, people care more about how the quality and condition of those trails rather than the number of people using those trails. The second thing we found is the difference across those groups. If you break down to what is the preferences between residents and tourists, residents value management of ecological health and trail infrastructure a little bit more than tourists. Residents prefer less crowded, makes sense. Tourists are not, they're moderate to crowds. They don't mind crowds in the trails. And then lastly, we found is tourists are willing to pay 2.5 times more for trail management than residents. We'll get into those just basically to give you an idea of what we found. So how do we do this? How do we get to those results? What we use is discrete choice experiment. It's a very nerdy economic valuation type of methods. What it essentially is an economic theory-driven survey used to understand how people value those different attributes based on policy options or management options. I'll get to the example that makes it easier. But what basically choice experiment trying to do is simulates real-world decision. It simulates sort of real-world policy options that people are debating on, and then trying to ask people what they prefer the most. So, for example, this is actually our survey. Before I get into the nitty-gritty of the main content of the survey, just to give you an idea of what discrete choice is, you have two alternatives on top. It's basically like option for policy 1 or management 1, option 2. And then you have attributes that you basically elicit and what people care about the most. From there, you just ask them whether you choose alternative 1 or alternative 2 based on the options that we put, the content that we put in the middle of the survey. I'll get into the content in a bit just to give you an idea what discrete choice experiment look like. Okay, just a little bit of what choice experiment have been used and over the years, been used to value natural landscape, value ecosystem surveys, natural capital, also used in sort of the big overall environmental valuation across a lot of natural resources. This book itself has a lot of recreational related valuation that people use for policy. So has quite a bit of credibility in terms of the method. It used to capture non-in-use values, just like the values that are the recreational side, the ecosystem side. Some studies even do capturing cultural values of fresh water. I think this study is in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And then choice experiment application in terms of have been used in trail management. There are few studies that looked at crowding and congestion. They looked at infrastructure and management attributes and ecological and landscape attributes as well. This is so small. Okay, bye. In Hawaii, choice experiments are mostly used for marine-related application studies. There are studies that have looked at, for example, the value of coral reefs based on the impact of climate change, the value of coastal water quality, beach quality, storm management, even dolphin excursion. They've used that before. For terrestrial, there's only 2 that we found. One is related to certified ecotourism, and one is myconia management. But to date, that we are aware of, there's no study that has explored especially the value of recreational trail using choice experiment, which is where this research is trying to fill that gap. Okay, so how does choice experiment work? We have 4 main steps. One, you have to define the attributes. That is basically, if you're trying to value something, what is the feature of that something, of the resources that you're trying to value? So basically, attribute is trying to draw the features of those natural resources. And then what is the level of those features? You set the levels, and then you design the survey, and then you analyze like many research. So for ours, we worked closely with DOFA and also looking at the literature, and we came up with 4 main attributes, which is the feature of those trails that we wanted to value the most. One is trail condition. Second one is the habitat quality. Third is crowding. And then the fourth one is basically cost per trip, like how much people are willing to pay the value that we have. I'll just give you a second. I'll take a sip of water if you want to take a time to read a little bit of the definitions. Right. So each of those attributes was designed carefully, and the language itself was worked for a couple of months trying to get the right language to, one, represent what we're trying to measure against. So what we're trying to value the non-use values and use values. How do we make sure that these attributes represent those? And two, we want to make sure that those attributes that people read when they go to the survey actually represents what DOFA is trying to do with their management. So long way to say that it took a while to make those attributes, but this is the main attributes, and this is how we're trying to measure the values. After you define the attributes, the next thing is you want to define the levels that each feature you want to measure its value. So our levels that we came up for the study is low, medium, and high, basically trying to mimic management level of medium, moderate, and if you just go all out effort in terms of budget and operational capacity. So we have high levels. Is if you think about high level of management for trail conditions, you go over 75% of trail is maintained and everything is like good and so on. Low levels is the worst case scenario if you think it that way. Same thing this is for habitat quality and trail condition. We also, for costs, this is the number of costs that we went with. At the beginning, we start with very low cost, like $2 was the minimum, and then the $40 was the highest. We tested in a pilot study, and actually we had a lot of people that willing to pay a lot more than $2. So we ended up with those values for willingness to pay. And then lastly, for attributes, there's the crowding. The difference of crowding of the other attributes is basically we use pictures to gauge people's perception of number of crowds that you see when you make those choices. This is, again, like the survey I was just showing you. So we have 2 alternatives on top. So management option, we have many of these in different levels and different combinations. So you can actually draw the attributes that people prefer and the levels. But for this purpose, the 2 alternatives is basically 2 different levels, 2 different content in each of them, and you have each attribute on the side. So for example, if you were to choose alternative 1, that's a person that says, I don't really care if the trail has low level of management, like 25% of the trail is maintained. I don't mind moderate chance of seeing native species, but I really care about number of people in the crowd, and I want to see less. So that person that chooses alternative 1 basically will choose that, and they're willing to pay $80, willing the value of that. Second one, the person 2 came in and said, no, actually, I don't really like that. I don't mind the crowd. I actually prefer the high habitat quality, performance, and management. So does the trail conditions. So if you put all those levels and attributes together, there's about 18,000 of those choice sets. Can you imagine asking 18,000 questions to a survey? Yes, no. So we basically did was 2 approach. One is fractional factorial de-efficient design. Again, another economic, very nerdy down the road type of thing. But what basically does is you take those 18,000 questions, and narrows down to 16. And that's pretty doable when you ask survey questions. Those 16 questions, what it does is it eliminates all the easy choices like low cost, high level of management, eliminates those, and it makes those 16 choices. People that see those 16 questions have to make really, really tough decision in terms of trade-offs. So like if I choose 1 or 2, or I choose none, depending on their choices. And lastly, we use attribute level balance. Because we're comparing residents and tourists, we want to make sure that the amount of levels of attributes that tourists see is almost similar to what residents see. What basically does is when you do analysis, you're comparing apple to apple kind of thing. Okay. So this survey is, we use Qualtrics to collect data. It's basically on Qualtrics. Every survey is online. And then we use a panel from a company named Cint. We basically pay people to come into our survey, fixed number of levels. So you are guaranteed a number of people that can come to our survey. This is what we got. Total participants is about 1,393 of them, right? and 321 of them incomplete. So basically they didn't completely finish our survey. But out of those 1,300 people, majority of them were tourists, and then a few of 339 residents. And this is how I picture people take our survey. Okay. And lastly, for methodology, to analyze our data, we base the theory on what the economists call random utility model. It's basically your utility or your preferences or happiness. It depends on a certain feature of something that you're willing to pay for. Simple example is you're buying a camera. Your utility of that camera is based on the quality of the camera, the battery life, and everything else. That's what basically this theory is saying. So for ours, your utility of trail sustainable management is one, depending on the quality of the habitat, the condition of those trails, the number of people you see, and how much actually it costs for you're willing to pay. From there, you can just do base calculation and take those numbers to let R do its job, and you get how much people are willing to pay, basically. Okay, so here's the results. This is the social demographic characteristic of the sample that we got. In terms of age, resident and tourists both are about 45-year-old on average. I think that's slightly older than the population in Hawaii. I think the median age is 41 or so. Sex, 55% of residents were male, 51% of tourists. Tourists a little bit more balanced. Residents is a little bit overrepresented in male side. We also asked whether people who came in on survey have used trails once before, and 88 or 9, almost 90% of both residents and tourists have used. Income-wise, they both fall into the level of residents is between the 50,000 and 75,000 household income, and then tourists is slightly higher in terms of 75 to 100,000. And then you have education, residents, medium education, and mean education is about associate technical degree, and then tourists is slightly higher for bachelor degree. Okay, so here is the main result. This is the why it took so long to get there. I just want to draw your attention to the first three columns, the highlighted here. Excuse me. So dependent variable on top is basically the average of all respondents, that is combined residents and tourists, and then residents separately, tourists separately. And each of the rows is basically the attributes that we have with the level of management. So habitat quality medium there basically means medium level of management for habitat quality, simple stuff. And then what we care about is this content in the middle. What it basically, these numbers means is the higher the coefficient, the stronger the preference, the happier people, or the choices that people prefer the most. So for example, if you block everything, just look at habitat quality and trail condition. The first choice of improvement that people prefer the most is associated with high level of habitat quality management and a high level of trail condition management. You can see is here on the results here, all respondents about almost 1.8. And when you break it down between residents and tourists, residents have almost double, or like the preferences is double for habitat quality and trail condition high level management. That basically means is they prefer it more than tourists. If you look at the second choice, which is the second choice of improvement and management level, that is associated with moderate habitat and trail improvements. So here, again, the numbers make sense, the numbers drop. And the main thing to take away from here is residents and tourists. If the management only go to moderate level of improvement, residents prefer to go straight first to habitat quality before trail condition, but tourists prefer it to go to trail condition first, if it's a moderate level of improvement. That's basically what we found. And then we have the third and the fourth choice of management is basically the least preferred choice when you compare to habitat quality and trail condition. So third choice is least crowded trail, so the least number of people, I don't mind that. And then fourth choice is moderate crowd people. The difference here is residents have really high utility here, the coefficient, the 0.7, for third choice of least crowded trail. So residents prefer the least number of people, and then tourists prefer moderate. They don't mind. Okay, in summary, what we found in this table is basically ecological health and trail infrastructure matter most for everyone. At the highest improvement level, like highest level of management, residents value both more strongly than tourists, but they both do value them the most. Moderate improvement, you have residents prioritize habitat quality and tourists prioritize trail condition. If you reduce crowding is the least matter for people when you compare habitat quality and trail condition. Residents want less crowd people and trail, and tourists is comfortable with moderate crowd levels. Okay, so if you take those results and put it in a dollar value, that's well, basically our cost in our attribute comes in. This is how much we have, like this is the result. So the willingness to pay per use. So for example, for our first choice of like the most first choice of improvement, they were willing to pay for a management of high level of management. Across all respondents, its habitat quality and recognition is about $60. Very, very high level of management. And then when you break it down between tourists and residents, there's a big difference, which I will highlight in the next slides. For this moderate habitat improvement, which is their second choice of improvement, they're willing to pay about $36 to $26 on average across respondents. And for the third and fourth choice, for least crowding, less crowd trails, average is about $25. And then for moderate crowd trails, it's about $20 or so. If you put those values into this graph and you want to see the difference between tourists and residents, for both habitat quality and trail condition, which is the most preferred choice in terms of management, whether it's high level or medium level, tourists have almost double how much they're willing to pay. Actually, if you do the math, for most preferred choice, tourists are willing to pay 2.5 times more for the management versus residents. For crowding, the least number of people, because tourists care more about moderate crowd than least crowd. So the difference is not as big for how much they're willing to pay. This one is an interesting one where tourists are willing to pay 20 times more for moderate crowd than residents. Caveat that this big difference is because residents are willing to pay to almost nothing, like $2 or close to zero if you take the average confidence level. Okay. So what does this willingness to pay value actually means? If you picture the people that I was talking about, use value and non-use values, everybody who value trails for their recreational use, for its preservation, future generation, for its existence and so on, picture them all in this triangle of trail use demand. And if you take the average of all respondent willingness to pay, those values that we have, some people are willing to pay $60. Some people are willing to pay $30, $26. Some people are willing to pay $25 for crowding and so on. And if you take the maximum value and the minimum value, there are within this sort of graph that there are different level of people and different kind of people are willing to pay differently for different management, right? And what this is what economists refer to as consumer surplus. And it's these values are basically means is the public benefits that receive from trail access and improvement measure as the value hold towards these trails beyond what they currently pay. Simply put, if you're willing to pay for a really, really good coffee at $10 and they charge you $3, that willingness to pay of $7 difference is your consumer surplus. That's the benefit that you still hold it yourself, you value the coffee still, but you only pay $2, $3. That's basically what we measure here, the willingness to pay. So there's really, really high willingness to pay and for what they currently pay, which is nothing, right? And what this basically means is that trails are generating substantial public benefits that are currently invisible to decision makers because no price exists to actually show them that these values exist. How do we use this? How much are these benefits and how can we use them to justify investment in trail? Well, we can do a quick exercise here. So for example, if you take visitor total benefits, let's just do a quick calculation. There's about 10 million people visit Hawaii every year. According to Hawaiian Tourism Board, 40% of people who came to Hawaii use trails. Let's just say that's our population of interest. 40% of 10 million, 4 million, right? And if you times that to the what we call compensated variation, is basically how much people are willing to pay the difference between low, medium, and high, you get something like this. I'll give you time to. So this is numbers that you can say total public benefits that people hold towards those trails beyond the values that you can measure through economic activities. So for example, if you just go all out, here the y-axis is estimated public benefits, so if you times the number, and then the x-axis is if you management focus on different trail attributes. So if you go all out on habitat quality, trail condition, and crowding, that's how much sort of the public benefits number that you could use and say, this is how much it values, right? Now, this is very, very like conservative and like indirect approximate calculation. There might be more. You can do a different calculation in your head of how many people actually use the trail for different programs of trail and state, Naala, and so on. But basically what you can use those value of willingness to pay is times how many people, and you get the total benefits that people hold towards those trails. And here you can use this value again to justify for trail investment. There are values to these trails that you're not accounted for, basically. Another thing you can use these values is cost benefit analysis. Basically trying to answer this question, how much more benefits do we gain if we invest a little bit more on each attribute? So for example, if you take currently habitat quality here is, let's say, an all trails in Hawaii is medium level. That's how much welfare or benefits that it generates, that you can say that's how much it's valued. But is it worth to go from medium level to high level? If you take the difference, it's about 147 million of values that people hold towards them aggregately. And let's say here, granted that we don't know how much it costs to go from medium level to habitat quality, like the high level. But say if the cost is a lot less, that's something you can use in terms of cost benefit analysis, but also putting the money with the most efficiently used. So for example, here, if you look at everything here, and let's say every condition you have is low levels, what would be the best, well, first, based on these numbers, the first thing that you could do in terms of gaining the most benefits is invested in trail medium level, because how much that benefits from 0 to 142 compared to others is really high. But you can also think about it differently and how you make those decisions. But what it basically does is give you another way of doing cost benefit analysis and another way of making decisions more efficiently based on the numbers that people are willing to pay. Okay, that was the tourist willingness to pay and resident willingness to pay. This part of the survey and part of the study is basically asking people whether there's any support for fee system, especially on recreational trails. So we asked them whether you're willing to pay any fee system to support trail management efforts. Tourists, 90% of them say yes. 80% of residents say yes. And if you even wanted to gauge the social norms, like saying, imagine 10 people in your social groups, how many of them would be willing to use those trails that have fee system? 7 out of tourists say yes, half of residents say yes. And then the other way you can ask is gauge social norm is, what do people expect you to do? So the question here is, imagine 10 people, how many of them are in your social circle that think you should, or people should pay for any fee system to support trail management? And the results is almost similar, half residents and 7 out of 10 of the tourists. We also ask questions like, if there any fee system, is there any preferences of cost allocation? Tourists and residents, basically 55, majority of tourists prefer both pay equally. And residents, the third of them say, yeah, pay equally, but the other third saying actually both pay, but majority pay. Majority of tourists take the cost of fee system. We also ask questions on payment mechanism. Is there any preferences on payment type? If there's any fee system, there's annual pass, daily pass, per entry fare, voluntary donation, and so on. The opinions were split. Majority of tourists would say prefer daily pass, and then residents, majority of them, third of them at least say per entry fee, but they are split between other payment preferences. Lastly, we'll also ask payment mechanism. If there is fee system, how would you like to pay? Like online, on-site, or is it centralized location? Basically, both tourists and residents prefer the least is centralized location, basically paying at the trailhead kind of thing. Okay, so key takeaways from both of our objectives of this research. One is trails are valued well beyond recreational. It basically means that the values of trails should not just be accounted from the recreational side, but also should be looked at on the non-use values, which is specifically in our research, we highlight trail condition and habitat quality. Users care deeply about ecological health and physical infrastructure. Residents strongly value ecological health and trail maintenance, especially residents compared to tourists. And there's about 2.5 times more willingness to pay from tourists than residents. Key takeaways from the preference on fee system, there's a wide support on fee system, and then there are varied preferences on payment mechanism based on where you take those information for management and so on. Lastly, there's management implication to this, right? You can use those information to invest, prioritize your investment, especially on trails that are degraded in habitat and trail infrastructure based on people's preferences to see them being properly invested and maintained. There's potential for fee tier fee system or dynamic fee structure, we're thinking about tourists willing to pay 2.5 times more, and there's different value how much people are willing to pay. There's site-based management implication and cost-benefit analysis, like I just talked to you about, how you can make decision a little bit more efficiently. Lastly, I want to highlight that this type of sustainable funding solution framework, zoom out a little bit from the research, have been used in many different countries and in many different islands, specifically in island nations that faces similar cases in Hawaii, where high tourism, very high use, climate pressure, but also limited resources. There's cases that mostly in island nation, in New Zealand itself uses a fee system for their prime conservation sites. Even here in Hawaii, you have the Hanoma Bay case, you have Aloha Ikekai, which is, okay, I'm trying to put that, so basically they charge a user fee of $1 per commercial recreational activity on ocean, right? Okay, and then there's the recent green fee that we just heard about. What I'm trying to say here is there are different sustainable funding solutions across islands that have been proven that works and can improve. And what this study is doing is basically providing an empirical foundation to extend those frameworks into Hawaii's trails. Lastly, there's next steps and limitation and for future research. There are a few things that needs to be paid more attention towards. Hypothetical bias. People often say they're willing to pay more than what they're actually willing to pay. So you can address those issues. Sample composition, you want to make sure that your sample of people coming to survey have a little bit more close to the true population. There's crowding perception. People see crowd differently. You can address that, clear opt-out alternatives, and potential endogeneity, which is a model type of issue. Nevertheless, I want to close this presentation with whether we examine we estimate those values aggregately, like how much total benefits that it holds, those non-use values and these values, whether we look at individuals' willingness to pay, or whether we see there's support on fee system or funding mechanism and also that. I think the conclusion here is consistent in what it shows through this research, is that sustainable trail management generates significant benefits that current funding fails to capture. And that properly valuing them is a necessary step towards securing the investment that trails, people, and the organizations that care for them, steward them, deserve. Thank you very much. I will take any questions.